All right, I believe they've all about made their way into Sharpening the Young Mind. We will continue on with our study, church history. I have a few make a comment that they were enjoying the study and appreciate all those kind words. With that, it is a good, interesting study. Sometimes things that are interesting to me, maybe not necessarily to everybody else, but enjoy that quite a bit, getting to study that. So I hope it's encouraging to you. And we're going to be picking up a little more steam today with this and showing a few more events that are going to be unfolding. Now, to put us back where we were at, we've talked about the church coming, the church through prophecy, that it was going to be built up like this, the time in which the church was established, and the idea that these things were going to be unfolding. And last week we discussed in Acts chapter 2 that the church was established and how the church was operating and how they were able to go out and do certain things. And we find them very flourishing throughout the area, that they are going out and they are preaching the gospel and people are giving, and the church is just at its peak almost in one sense. 3,000 people are being baptized, and then 5,000, great multitudes, even some of the priests. All these individuals are coming to the church. So from that, we have that in Acts chapter 2, and then chronologically as we look at our Bibles, we have often referred to, like you go to Acts chapter 2, or in Acts, we have the gospel for why I need to be a Christian. We have the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Then we have Acts, and that's church history, or the history of things going on. And we say, all right, that shows me how to get into the church. And then the rest of the epistles, we find that showing us how to remain faithful. And then in the book of Revelation is why I am to remain faithful. So that's kind of how the Bible is laid out. So again, from Acts chapter 2, just in the way your Bible is laid out, we find the events that Paul and other men are going to be writing throughout, Peter being another one, James, Jude, these men writing these epistles or letters to these congregations. So the church is established in Pentecost. They go out, and we're going to make a little bit note of this. They are to make elders. They're going to appoint elders in every congregation. They have deacons that are going to be made in the congregations. We find that the qualifications for the elders, the qualifications for the deacons, that's how we get this. This is how God wanted the church governed. So he's looking at these things. And then we go through the epistles, and we find oftentimes in the epistles things that the churches were going through. That's why we have them and we read them, to why we know how to operate in the church today. And then we have other passages through that, again, like 1st, 2nd Peter and Jude, encouraging words, talking about these things, even 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, all these things going about that are talking about the churches that were affecting in that time. So now we're going to jump to about AD 100 and go a little farther. So again, AD 32, 33, there when Jesus is crucified, the church is established now from that time to AD 100. So we're going to kind of jump through the line with that, and we're going to continue as we go through this, and we're going to talk, we're going to look at the uninspired writings and the apostolic fathers, what's going to be happening here. Now, this uninspired writings aren't going to be like we talked about before, like with the Apocrypha and those writings like that, though some of these get looped into some of that kind of writing. They're not in the Apocrypha. But these men essentially were men that were watching, seeing the apostles. So that's these apostolic fathers. They're not inspired. They're not apostles. So let's understand that as we dive into this. So again, from Acts 2 until AD 100, so that span of time has been occurring. The church is growing, the church is being established, the gospel is being preached, these letters are going out. We discussed the idea of the canon. Now we have the letters that are being circulated throughout the churches, so here we are. So he makes note in our book that we're kind of following through, the purity of the New Testament church was soon lost. So that's what I was excited for teaching this one, not for what's happening, but we're going to begin to see this departure that's going to happen. The Holy Spirit revealed to the apostles that there would shortly be a departure from the divine pattern, and they in turn prepared the bishops of the church for the coming departure. Let's go to Acts chapter 20, and let's just make note of this as we do this, because it's going to help build on to some other passages as we go. So there's going to be a coming departure. There's going to be happening, right, that the church being ran the way God wants it ran, right, being established like that, and the way that it's affecting isn't going to last long in the big scheme of things. It's going to be taking a departure. But what we're going to be looking at is from this departure, we're going to see how it really gets involved with this, and it really opened up my eyes when I was studying. So look at in Acts chapter 20 and verse 17. And from Miletus he sent to Ephesus and called the elders of the church. Now we're going to make a point of that being elders here in just a moment. So Paul's about to leave. He sends for the church, the elders of the church of Ephesus, to come to him. So for time's sake, we're not going to read all that, but I would encourage you to go through that. Now notice what he says in verse 28. He's speaking to the elders, again, keeping the Bible in context. He's talking to them. He's discussing these things with them. In verse 28, it says, "Take heed, therefore, unto yourselves and to all the flock, over the which the Holy Ghost hath made you overseers, to feed the church of God, which he hath purposed with his own blood. For I know this, that after my departing shall grievous wolves enter in among you, not sparing the flock." So Paul telling them this, the elders, now these bishops, overseers, shepherds, however these all terms all mean the same individual. He said there's wolves. Again, think of the sheepfold, right? That flock. The wolves are going to come in. These wolves are coming in and they're going to be making havoc of the church there in your area. He says, not sparing the flock, verse 30, also of your own selves shall men arise, speaking perverse things to draw away disciples after them. So there's going to be a coming away, right? This is Acts 20. Acts 2, the church is established. Now we're in Acts 20. Paul's saying, listen, these things are all going to come about, and it's going to happen even from within the church. Now, again, that's not so much the church of today, but let's notice that from within the church that these things were going to be taking place. So let's go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Again, nothing new, unfortunately, that this falling away was going to be happening. And we're going to be discussing that in the next few lessons, this falling away. But notice in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and I'm glad we were able to hit on this because it goes in with what we were talking about this morning. In our worship assembly, we were talking about how that the church at Thessalonica, they were afraid of their loved ones. Well, when Paul was saying, hey, they're going to be fine, you're going to be fine, Christ is going to return. 2 Thessalonians, he's writing because these individuals pretty much just gave up on life, and they said, well, if Christ is going to return at any moment, I'm not worried about anything, right? I'm not worried about making a living. But Paul has to kind of correct them here, and he says, don't give up and just sit there idle all day, because some stuff has got to happen. So let's look at 2 Thessalonians, beginning in verse 3, or chapter 2, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3. "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come," talking about the coming of the Lord, "except there be a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Remember ye not that when I was yet with you, I told you these things." So what Paul's saying to let's just pick up verse 6. "And now ye know that without withholding that he might be revealed in his time, for the mystery of iniquity doth already work, only he who now letteth will let until he be taken out of the way." So a lot of people look at 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and this man of perdition, the son there that he's talking about, the man of sin, son of perdition. They look at this as the Antichrist and say, see, he's going to be sitting, exalting himself as God. Paul's not talking about that. He said that Jesus isn't going to return until there's a falling away. Now, there's two different views on who this man of sin is. Neither one of them is the Antichrist. But the man of sin, it might be that he's the Jewish high priest. Now, those that have been here for the Leviticus class understand that the high priest, he stayed a high priest until he died, and that he went into the Holy of Holies to make atonement for the children of Israel once a year. Now we find, we were looking at that through Leviticus and Hebrews, that Christ now is our high priest. We don't need a high priest here on earth. So one school of thought is that this man of sin is the high priest. It was a Jewish high priest. Jesus was up in heaven as our high priest, but there was still a man on earth being the high priest, still sacrificing animals, even though they weren't under that law anymore, right? They're under the law of Christ. So he's up there. He's acting like God, right? He's sitting in the holy place. He's positioning himself like that, right? He's sitting in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So that's what the high priest was doing. He was forgiving the sins of the people, but he couldn't do that anymore because Christ died on the cross. So he had no power to do that. So there's some school of thought that look at this Son of Man, the man of sin there, being the Jewish high priest after Christ died. Now, why is that important about AD 70? Matthew 24 we've been talking about. Like we said, if this man is setting himself up as God, going into the holy place, in AD 70 the temple's destroyed, Judaism's done, right? We made a point of that last week when when it talks about that apocalyptic language, the moon falling, the stars falling, the sky turning to blood, all that, moon turning to blood, sky falling, all that talks about the coming of Judaism being destroyed at that time. So you might think of that school of thought as that. But another man you might think about, and I tend to lean this way, I believe that this is the Roman Catholic Pope. So we're going to get into that as we begin to point towards that way. Keep this man in mind as you look at this. Because we find him acting as God, does he not? The Roman Catholic Pope now, he says he's divinity, right? If he says that it's okay to accept anybody into the church, everybody in the Catholic Church takes that as fact and say, well, he said it, right? The Pope said it. He's God here on earth. So he sits in the temple. So you might look at that as the temple of God, as the exact temple of God, or that he's sitting himself up in that position, right, on that throne, acting as God. The one point for the high priest, many people look and says that the iniquity is already at work at that time, that the high priest was already sitting there in the temple at that time. But the other school of thought is that we're going to see here that the workings of a bishop as a pope are already beginning to form in this time. So these workings of this division are already at work. So either school of thought you want to talk about or to think that is, either one of them, I don't know. It's kind of one of those things when we get to heaven we'll have to ask and see. But I do know it's not talking about the Antichrist, because these things were happening at this time. And this is before, again, this 2 Thessalonians written in the 60s and the 70s ADs, not talking about 2023. So none of that. Now, so the coming departure, these things are going to be happening. So let's continue on through this and look at these apostolic fathers. So the uninspired writers who did their work from the year 100 to 150 are generally referred to as the apostolic fathers. Now note what these men had in common. These men knew the apostles personally. They knew people that had known them, right? So they say, well, I didn't personally know John or Paul, but I knew someone that did know him. And they had received their teachings in a direct manner. So maybe they sat at the foot of John while he was preaching and teaching, or any of the men, right? Peter or Paul. They were listening to his teachings. We know through the book of Acts that the apostles were doing that. They were going into the temples and the synagogues, and they were teaching and preaching. So they said, well, we're not apostles, but we heard them speak directly. So kind of an eyewitness, if you will. So during this period, the church was facing with growing heresies from within and developing persecution from without. So the Greek philosophy, and again, I love how all this stuff ties together. What did we talk about at the beginning? Rome is under the Roman power, but the Greek language, that Greek culture, is all scattered out through Alexander the Great, and he's in there. So this philosophy, this way of thinking, is beginning to creep in to the church. Judaizers were continuing to require Christians to keep the law of Moses. So we don't have time to look at it today, but Acts chapter 15, 1 through 9, that's when they go through and they actually have to go to Jerusalem and talk to the elders at Jerusalem and find out if people have to be circumcised anymore. Because, again, as we've been talking about in Leviticus for years, right? Thousands of years, the children of Israel understood what's clean, what's unclean. We talked about that last week with the Jews and the Gentiles. This mindset they had to break. And they were like, well, we got to be circumcised. But when you look through Acts 15, 1 through 29, they make a good case for that and say, no, we don't have to be. The Gentiles were able to be added into the church. We saw that last Sunday with Cornelius and his household. The tongues fell on them, right? The Holy Spirit fell on them with the tongues. So they said, no, if that happened, then they're okay to be in here. They don't have to be circumcised. But these things were even occurring at that time. And we find throughout the writings that these Judaizers, when I say that, it means the people that were trying to keep Judaism going, right? These Jews that had converted to Christianity, they just couldn't break the habit of some of these older habits of circumcision and sacrifices, and it was just taking them a long time to get through that. So we already have that working amongst them. Now, following the death of the apostles, each church was governed by a plurality of elders. So this is important. This is where we begin to get off the rails with the church. They were governed by a plural, right? You got to have more than one, so at least 2 elders, like we have today here in Murray City. No distinction was made between an elder and a bishop, as both terms were used interchangeably, having reference to the same individual. So when we look at that, and I've got the Greek word episkopos, that's what that word means, as bishop. And that's an interesting, when you hear that episkopos, episcopate, you kind of hear that start in your ear. And then we find, even in Acts chapter 20 and verse 17, the elders being discussed as using that Greek word presbyteros. So we kind of hear that word too, right? Presbyteros, presbyter. So you begin to hear those things. We're going to get into that a little later on, of these divisions throughout, the separations from the church. Now, it's important that we realize this at this junction of our study, that this is where it begins to get off the rails, is because they're going to make a distinction. Now, today, we think about that, we say, well, we got 2 elders here. But we wouldn't probably call them bishops, would we? We probably wouldn't say, well, I've got 2 bishops down here at church, because when we hear the word bishop, our mind goes to what? The Roman Catholic Church. Like, oh, I've seen the bishop on TV. He's the guy in all the garb, right? That bishop. Well, I don't want to make reference to that. But in the New Testament, the bishop meant overseer or guardian. And we understand that's what the elders are for us today. And again, in Acts chapter 20 and verse 28, when we were looking at that he uses the term elder first there in verse 17, and then in verse 28, he uses the word as overseer, right? The shepherds to the flock. So these are what the elders are to do. So there's no distinction between them. But we continue on. Now, in AD 96, they're developed in the church, and we're going to be talking about Clement of Rome, if you've ever heard that individual, Clement of Rome. In AD 96, they're developed in the church of Corinth, a rebellion of young men against the elders. So to encourage the Corinthian church to settle its difficulties, the church at Rome, where Clement of Rome was an elder at the church there at Rome, wrote a general letter, which some believe came from that pen of Clement. So this letter soon began to be circulated and was even accepted as inspired writing. So again, you have to remember, at this time, there were letters going around. We talked about that quite a bit with the canon, and we're going to touch up on that again through our lessons here. So if you missed some of that, or you think, well, I need to hear that again, we'll get through it. So it's circulating around as inspired, but he would appeal to the blessed epistle of Paul the Apostle as authority, and considered his own as a work of admonition, so an act of warning. Clement of Rome did not say that he was inspired. His writings were not inspired. His letter was just, hey, you need to be warned about this stuff. I'm warning you. This is what I'm writing this letter for. But many people began to show that as an inspired writing. Now, this letter showed that the church was governed by elders. So this is what we're going to be. You're going to see this theme through many of these men. We have their writings. They're not inspired writings. They're historical writings. But from their writings, we can see that the church was governed by that plurality of elders. There was no distinction between bishops or elders. And that the eldership was to continue in the churches. This is vital as we get into this. So these men, they weren't a distinction. They needed that, and we find that from history, even past the death of the apostles. Now we're going to look at Ignatius of Antioch. This individual, he really goes off the rails, and I'm going to make my point here right now. His writings have generally been regarded as how he wanted the church to be instead of how it actually was. So many of his writings tend to be, when they go back and look at other historical evidence, they're like, well, none of this stuff was happening. Nobody else talks about this stuff, and it seems more like he was kind of wanting it to get like this. So all the other writings of the time agree that the church was governed by the plurality of elders, and that no congregation had a monarchical bishop as he advocated. So what does that mean? It means we need one man, one bishop, to kind of oversee everything. Now that's what, when we begin to get off the rails, and you'll kind of see those pictures put together here, or the puzzle pieces kind of going together. Look, Ignatius believed that the church could be protected from heresy and could be unified only by one individual in each congregation assuming the position of authority. Now what is he getting at with this? He says, all right, we have our congregation here. I'm just going to use that as an example. We say, well, Mr. Brad, Mr. Harold, right there, we need one of these men. He's going to be kind of the head elder, right? He's going to be kind of the main elder. And when something happens, we're going to go to him, and with him being the head, right? Mr. Harold, he's going to be the head elder, right? So it doesn't matter if he and Brad make a decision. He's going to be kind of the fail-safe. And then it's going to be like, all right, well, we can do the same thing with Mr. Brad, right? He's going to be the man, and he's going to be kind of watching everything and making sure we don't get off the rails. And initially, we think, well, that's probably not a bad idea. We don't want to get off. You get a good, sound man in the faith, and he'll be in charge of everything, but that's not how God governed it. And from this, we find the corruption that's going to take place. So, as bishop means overseer, he naturally placed the chairman over the elders as the bishop. So again, we think, all right, we have bishops and elders. These are the same individuals, according to the New Testament, according to how God laid out this. They're overseers, they're elders, they're shepherds over the flock. But now we're going to make the bishop over the elders. So hard to use it with our, because we only have 2 men. But say you had a congregation of 5 men as elders. Then we've got to have the chairman of the elders, right? The chairman, he's going to make sure that the other elders don't make a decision that affects the church. So we have this man, he's going to be the bishop. We're going to call him the bishop. He's the overseer of the other elders. So you see how easily that becomes a problem? Now, let's look at this. So following, this is what Ignatius of Antioch would say. Now, again, 2 Thessalonians 2, the man of sin, think about the Catholic Church. Follow the bishop as Jesus Christ, the presbytery, or the eldership, as the apostles, and respect the deacons. Let no man perform anything pertaining to the church without, not the eldership, without the bishop. So, I've got a 5 eldership congregation. I've got 1 man in charge. I've got to go to him, and from that, I'm going to get that. Now, time won't get us because we're going to have to speed through a few more things, but let me make this point real quick, because this is where we're getting at with this departure and how we get all the way into the Roman Catholic Church and some of the events that they were doing, and we're going to get into that. So we say, all right, I've got 5 elders, I need 1 man in charge, and he begins to take this, and he's in charge of this congregation. Well, I don't know how many congregations are in Crockett County, but we have these elders, and they say, well, we needed 1 man over all of these congregations, right? We need 1 sound man. He's going to be kind of in charge. He's the overseer, and he's just going to make sure that everything's done. Next thing you know, you have 1 man being over the churches in Crockett County. Now again, the church, Acts chapter 20, verse 28, you watched over the flock, that flock, right? Mr. Brad, Mr. Harold, they have no authority outside of here at Murray City. They can't go to Alamo. They can't go to Cairo, any of those, any congregation say, well, they're going to affect this. This is not how God illustrated the church to be. They control this flock. They don't make any decisions. That's why the problem I have with so many associations today, what do they have? A headquarters. I'm not talking about the Catholic Church. I'm talking about other denominations, not other ones. Denominations that have a headquarters, and what do? They bring all that down and they say, all right, you're going to teach this material, you're going to preach on this stuff. That's not how God designed it. He didn't. And that's how easily it gets to that. They say, all right, we got Crockett County, we got that bishop. Now we need a bishop for Tennessee. Now we need a bishop for the United States. That's how the Roman Catholic Pope got into his power. As the bishops began to grow, then they would envelop other congregations. They began to grow, and before you know it, you had one man making the decisions for everything. So that's what we're getting at with Ignatius of Antioch. And that's what we're going to be talking about for the next few lessons. So with the time that we have, let's quickly go through these. You may hear of some time about the Didache. And this is the teachings of the 12 apostles. This wasn't an inspired writing. Again, this was written between AD 90 to AD 150. So these things we're talking about. But from this, we understand that from 100 to 150 AD, in history, that the church was governed by the plurality of elders. Polycarp, we may have heard of this man. I love his quotes. He's about to be burned at the stake there because he won't. Again, we talked about that, how the Christians, they would just denounce Christ, praise Caesar, praise them, bow down to their gods. He says, for 86 years have I been his servant, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? Polycarp, and then they light the fire there. He says, you threaten me with a fire that burns for a time and is quickly quenched, for you do not know the fire which awaits the wicked in the judgment to come and in everlasting punishment. Now again, this is taken around 115, 156 is when Polycarp lived. So these events were happening. We have historical evidence of this. But in Polycarp's writing, he mentions no distinction between bishop and elder. So from that, and that's what we're going to be, and we'll finish here right here. That's what we're noticing, and that's what we're going to be looking at as we continue. So there's going to be trying to make a distinction and say there's going to be one man in each congregation, and again, from one congregation being over other congregations. And from this, we're going to have our great departure over to what the Catholic Church has become. Then we have the Reformation movement. Martin Luther saying, wait a minute, this stuff isn't right. We talked about that in our When we're looking at the canon, that the Bible wasn't printed, they didn't have these things, so they were just pretty much doing whatever they wanted to do. We have Martin Luther reforming the church, saying we don't need to follow the Catholic Church, we need to do this. And then we have the branches breaking off, the Puritans, the Presbyterians, all that stuff breaking out from that, the Lutherans. So you have this great division there because the church, not the Church of Christ, because there's always a remnant, right? There's always a faithful remnant, but we find these individuals breaking away, and then becoming what would later be called as the Roman Catholic Church. So, I know I sped through that as well. Again, we have these videos. I appreciate Brad making a comment of that. If you missed something, if you want to catch back up on it, please feel free. We have Facebook, or you can get on YouTube. If you have individuals that you know, you work with, everybody's got access, or it seems like most people have access to those pages. Turn them on that. We've got it all labeled where you can go back and read anything that you want. So I'm excited about this. We're going to find out here where we begin to pull off from this original pattern of the New Testament church, and we find a lot of the divisions that we have even today still. So thank y'all all for being here. Any questions or comments maybe about any of that?